Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the book club. Today, we are looking at Severance by Ling Ma. Typically, with these book reviews, I would start by reading the back, but it has nothing but reviews on the back. It's just all like rave reviews type of things. Um, so there is no synopsis on this book. It's which is interesting. I think it's kind of interesting. Before we go any further, I do want to say that this book was recommended to me by my coworker Emma. So thank you. That's it. Just thank you for the recommendation. There's a lot going on in this book. I read this right after I read Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl, which I talked about in the last video. But I think it's good that I read this one right after because unlike Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl, which is a very light read, this was a very dense, full of detail kind of book, which I'll be honest, I don't normally read. And so at first, I was getting through this book very, very slowly. But after a little while, I started getting into it, and it got easier to read. But also, I started to get a sense for the just the dense amount of detail on each page. The book itself, first of all, has a lot of characters, so I'm not going to name them all. I don't even think I remember all of the names. But the main character is Candace Chen. There's actually a lot I can say about this book. The first thing I'm going to say is it bounces through three different perspectives. It bounces between a present day perspective of the character. It then will occasionally jump to a sort of recent past. So I guess you could say like a 1 year ago kind of past. And then it will also reflect back on her childhood. So Candace Chen is like 20 something. And so the story bounces between a perspective of her like current life, her life about 1 year ago, and then her life as a child. The book takes place at the beginning of the apocalypse, which is very interesting. There's this thing in the book called, it's called Shen Fever. And it's basically like a zombie apocalypse type of thing, but it's not necessarily like zombies. They're called the fevered. So anyone who gets this Shen fever, which is like a fungal infection that gets into your brain, and then it basically strips you of your consciousness and diminishes your like bodily functions down into just your routines. Which is like a really creepy kind of take on the whole zombie thing. The people that become fevered, all they do is the same things over and over and over again on loop, day in and day out, until they basically die, because everything they do is sort of mined. So like they'll mine eating, but there's no food on the plate, right? But they'll take their fork and they'll hit against the plate, and then they'll put the fork in their mouth, but there's no food, right? So they're just like doing the actions of these routines, but they're not actually doing anything, which is like really kind of creepy. But so that's like the apocalypse. Candace is one of the few people that has not become fevered. So she is functioning, but she's seeing like everything fall apart around her. And so that's like the present day sort of part of this book. But it also bounces between like a year ago perspective, like a flashbacks to 1 year ago, where the fever like just begins spreading. That perspective basically goes from 1 year before, like right as the fever starts, up until the beginning of the book in terms of the present day perspective, right? And then you have a third perspective, which is just occasionally jumps back to childhood memories of Candace. The book is kind of written like a journal. There's no quotation marks for when anyone's talking, which I think is an interesting choice. Obviously, it's a conscious choice, but it does get a bit hard at times to tell who's talking. The book does a good job of describing the mundane in a fantastical way, if that makes sense. But it does a good job of taking these like mundane things. There's a scene where they go to a book manufacturing factory in China, and it's described like well, maybe not like Willy Wonka's factory, but like it's just described as like very grand, and everything in this book is described with so much detail where it almost seems fantastical, but they're describing mundane things. And it's a very strange sort of perspective that the book takes. There's so much detail in like the littlest things. Everything is so vivid and so clear, but they're describing like an office building. The book has a lot of discussion. The book talks a lot about religion. It talks a lot about routine, obviously because of the zombie thing, but not just the zombies' routine, but just like everyday routine for an actual human being. And a lot of just about like modern interaction and surviving in the modern world as well as surviving in the apocalypse, which isn't something that is as relatable as surviving in the modern world, but you know. And each sort of time frame that the book discusses, whether it's during the apocalypse, right before the apocalypse, or the main character's childhood, gives different perspective on religion, different perspective on routine, different perspective on surviving, which is also interesting. So you're getting 3 different perspectives from 3 different times in the character's life, all in this one book that is just packed with detail in its discussion. But also, the book isn't preachy. Sometimes you'll have books that you can tell are clearly trying to make a point, right? But this book does a good job of saying everything, but just saying it and leaving it for you to think about, rather than being like, this is right, this is wrong. It's sort of just the character like saying, this is what happened in my life, here's where I am now, but I'm still sort of unsure about what's going on here. So it provides so much perspective without necessarily forcing one perspective or saying one perspective is right. The books that I will be reading for the foreseeable future are all recommendations, but I think that's like part of the fun is like I can read a book and then talk about it with the coworker that recommended it to me, which is like really nice, and it also allows me to expand my knowledge of like different genres. Like I would not have read this book under normal circumstances, but I'm so happy I did. I want to give my one critique. So here's my one critique. Unlike Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl, where you know it had some vulgar bits, but I felt like it was very fitting because of the context of its plot. This book has some it has some parts that are a bit more vulgar, but I don't think it was as necessary to include those parts. And it's just like random too. Like you're sort of just reading the book and it has this flow, and it almost feels like when the vulgar stuff comes in that the flow feels completely interrupted. And maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's supposed to be that way, but I didn't find it particularly necessary. That's my one critique. But other than that, like those things aside, it was super in detail and super descriptive. I think I'm gonna leave it there in terms of my thoughts. The review out of 10 is gonna be I'm gonna give it. I'm debating between 8 and an 8.5. I'm gonna give it. You know what? I'm gonna none of this half point nonsense. We'll give it an 8. 8 out of 10. Super solid. It did have a few misses for me in terms of like the vulgar thing, but other than that, like super solid. I feel like that review might change just because like in the future, just because I'm not used to reading books that are as detailed, which sounds kind of dumb on my part, but as densely packed as this book is. That's about that for this book. So for the YouTube peeps, thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.